There is a truth about growing older that most people only discover when it's already too late. And it's an uncomfortable one to hear, but you need to hear it now, while there is still time. The truth is this: you have most likely spent your entire life building your happiness on foundations that will sooner or later disappear. Your appearance, your physical strength, your role at work, the constant company of the people around you. All of it feels like solid ground, firm and permanent, something you can stand on forever. But in reality, it is shifting sand, disguised as rock. And when old age arrives, it tests every single inch of that foundation, without any mercy at all. But more than 2,500 years ago, one of the greatest sages humanity has ever known mapped out exactly what happens when those outer structures begin to crumble. His name was Confucius, and while nearly everyone in his time was chasing after fleeting achievements and the pleasures of the world, he devoted his entire life to discovering something far more valuable: what truly holds up the human heart when everything else falls away. And he arrived at a surprising conclusion. After a certain age, it is not 1,000 things that bring real happiness. It is only four. Four inner pillars that, when built well, transform old age not into decline, but into liberation. And here is the problem, the thing that worries me and makes me want to talk with you today. Most people build these four pillars far too late, or they never build them at all. They reach 60, 70, 80 years old, and they find themselves standing before a merciless mirror, asking the most frightening question of all: who am I now that everything I leaned on has vanished? Stay with me until the very end, because I'm going to show you exactly what these four things are, in the right order in which they should be cultivated, and how each one can turn your coming years into the freest, most complete chapter of your entire life. No matter your age right now. The best day to start building was 20 years ago. The second best day is today. But before we begin, do me one small kindness that helps me a great deal. Leave your like here on the video, because that's how this profound wisdom reaches more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring together how to live with meaning and dignity in every season of life. And tell me down in the comments what city and state you're watching from, and how old you are. It's fascinating to see how these ancient truths touch people in such different places. Deal? Then come with me. Let me first show you the pattern that Confucius observed, because once you see it, everything else falls into place. He noticed something devastating about the human experience of growing older. The vast majority of people build their entire sense of self on foundations that are, by their very nature, temporary. Relationships that eventually change or end, social roles that one day become irrelevant, bodies that slowly lose their vitality, the recognition and admiration that in time simply fade away. And over, he watched the same scene unfold. People who had been successful, loved, admired their whole lives, arriving at old age and experiencing a deep and painful collapse from the inside. Why does that happen? Because they never developed what he called inner autonomy, the capacity to find meaning and worth within themselves, independent of the circumstances outside. There is an old teaching from that tradition that captures it perfectly. The wise person looks within, while the ordinary person looks to others. And here is the trap. That dependence on the outer world works beautifully, right up until the moment it stops working. In youth, it's easy to ignore this vulnerability. There is always someone around, always something happening, always a distraction close at hand. Physical energy covers up the fragility hidden inside, but old age dissolves those illusions with surgical precision. The children grow up and build lives of their own. A spouse may pass away, or slowly become an emotional stranger across the breakfast table. Friends disappear, whether through distance, illness, or death. The work that gave your days their purpose comes to an end, and the body, which for decades obeyed the commands of the mind, begins to impose its own rules instead. And suddenly, the person finds themselves standing before that merciless mirror, asking the question they spent a lifetime avoiding. Who am I when all of this is gone? Confucius saw that most people answer that question with pure existential panic. They try desperately to hold the outer structures in place, forcing relationships that have long since died, clinging to social roles that no longer fit, denying the simple physical reality of aging. And the result is an old age marked by bitterness, resentment, and a deep and aching loneliness. It becomes a slow shipwreck. But there is another way, one that this ancient wisdom mapped out with remarkable care. It is not about eliminating the difficulties of old age, which would be naive. It is about building inner pillars so solid that when the outer world crumbles, you discover you are still standing. And more than that, you discover a freedom that was simply impossible while your identity was tied to things outside yourself. There is a beautiful line attributed to Confucius describing his own life, that by 70 he could follow his own heart without ever crossing what was right. That is the promise here. The urgent question is not whether you will grow old, because everyone does. The question is whether you are building right now the foundations that will decide whether your old age becomes a shipwreck or a liberation. Because here is the unsettling part. There is no third option. So let's begin with the very first of those four things, the one everything else is built upon. The first thing that will bring you real happiness after 60 is the ability to be alone without experiencing solitude as misery. Confucius saw this as the foundational pillar, the one all the others rest upon. Learning to inhabit your own company, not as a punishment or an exile, but as a form of freedom. And please understand, this is not simply about being physically by yourself. It's about building a deep and genuine relationship with your own self, one that doesn't depend on anyone else being present in order to have value. In that tradition, it was taught that the wise person finds contentment within, while the foolish one is always chasing it in others. People who never develop this capacity fall apart when relationships inevitably change or come to an end. They experience physical solitude as a kind of annihilation because they never learn to tell the difference between being alone and being lost. And that difference is everything. Being alone can actually be the very condition for true inner freedom, a quiet space where your own consciousness can finally grow, without the constant distortions of other people's opinions, without social expectations, without the exhausting need to perform for an audience. But this doesn't happen by accident. It requires deliberate cultivation, practiced over years. Think about someone who spends decades defining their worth entirely through the eyes of others. Every decision filtered through the question, what will they think? Every emotion carefully calibrated for outside approval. And then old age quietly removes that audience. The children move away. The spouse passes on. The colleagues retire. And that person is left standing before a terrifying emptiness. Not because they are physically alone, but because they never developed an authentic inner voice to keep them company. The silence, which could have been a refuge, becomes a torment instead. The good news is that building this pillar begins with something wonderfully simple. Picture a person who every evening sits alone with a good book and a warm cup of tea. They are not running from the solitude. They are deliberately filling it with meaning. They aren't waiting for someone to come along and validate the moment. The moment has value in itself, simply because they are fully present for their own life. That is the crucial distinction. This is not about rejecting relationships. It's about freeing yourself from their tyranny. When you can find peace in your own presence, your relationships actually transform. They stop being emotional crutches and become free choices instead. You connect with others not out of desperation, but out of a genuine desire to share. Not out of a neurotic need, but out of real affection. And that changes everything about the quality of your connections. The consequence of neglecting this pillar is an old age where every moment alone feels like torture, where the television runs constantly as an anesthetic against the emptiness inside, where the absence of other people reveals a far more frightening absence, that of a self that was never truly developed. But when this pillar is built well, it transforms mere loneliness into solitude, a sacred space of reflection and freedom. And once you can stand comfortably in your own company, you're ready to build the second thing, which shapes the very rhythm of your days. The second thing that brings deep happiness after 60 is order in your daily life, which quietly becomes the foundation of order within. And this one reveals something genuinely counterintuitive. The outer structure of your everyday life is not merely practical. It is, in a real sense, spiritual. The way you organize your surroundings and your routine both reflects and shapes the state of your inner world. Confucius taught that the one who cannot govern their own household cannot truly govern themselves. Order in daily life doesn't mean an obsession with cleanliness or a rigid, anxious perfectionism. It means creating rhythm, structure, and a gentle predictability that free the mind for higher things. Here's why this matters so much. When chaos rules your days, your consciousness stays trapped, endlessly dealing with the disorder around it. There is simply no energy left over for reflection, for growth, for the deeper questions of a life well lived. Consider the classic example. A person living in a home overflowing with unnecessary things, old clothes never worn, broken objects that will someday supposedly be repaired. Each of those objects carries a weight, unprocessed memories, decisions endlessly postponed, attachments that quietly prevent any movement forward. The result is an environment that literally presses down on the spirit, day after day. There is a hard truth in this ancient wisdom. Attachment to the past, once it crystallizes into physical objects, becomes a prison in old age. When the time remaining becomes precious and limited, wasting your mental energy maintaining a relationship with obsolete things is a quiet form of betrayal against yourself. Every unnecessary object you cling to is energy stolen from the present moment. But order goes beyond physical space. It's also about creating structure in time, routines that give shape to your days, waking at a consistent hour, having small morning rituals that mark the transition from sleep into conscious waking life, establishing gentle rhythms for meals, for reading, for reflection, not out of rigidity, but out of freedom. And here is the paradox Confucius uncovered, one that surprises almost everyone. Structure does not limit your freedom, it makes freedom possible. When there is no structure at all, the mind wanders chaotically, held hostage by impulses, distractions, and anxieties. But when there is a basic order in place, the mind is finally set free to turn toward the things that truly matter. A person who develops this pillar in old age keeps an organized home, not out of vanity, but as an expression of genuine self-respect. They keep a routine, not out of boredom, but as a foundation of dignity, because they understand that an ordered home reflects an ordered mind, and an ordered mind is the ground on which an autonomous, meaningful life is built. Neglecting this pillar leads to a chaos that multiplies on itself. Outer disorder creates inner confusion. A lack of structure in time leads to days that dissolve without any meaning at all. And in old age, when there is no longer a structure imposed by work or by family, the absence of self-created order can lead to a quiet collapse, one that often disguises itself with the phrase, "I just don't have anything to do anymore." The person who has built this pillar, however, gives their own days shape and purpose from the inside. And once your outer life has a steady rhythm, you're ready for the third thing, which is perhaps the hardest to build and the most liberating of them all. The third thing that brings genuine happiness after 60 is a kind of quiet freedom from the judgment of others. This is perhaps the most difficult pillar to build and also the most liberating. Confucius identified it as the ultimate test of inner autonomy, the ability to act according to your own principles, even when the whole world disagrees. He taught that the superior person stands firm in their convictions, while the ordinary person bends to the opinion of the crowd. because dependence on other people's approval is a subtle but devastating form of slavery. Think about what it really means. When your sense of worth depends on outside approval, you hand over the control of your inner peace to forces you cannot possibly control. Every criticism becomes an existential wound. Every disapproving glance threatens your very sense of who you are. In youth, this dependence can almost work, because there's enough energy to perform constantly, to adjust the social mask, to chase validation tirelessly. But old age exposes just how unsustainable that whole system really is. The body no longer has the energy for constant performance, and the world, frankly, cares less and less about your approval seeking. And so you come face to face with the truth, that you may have spent your entire life as a slave to judges who never really cared that much to begin with. Confucius is radical here. He teaches that you must learn to say no to the opinions of others in order to preserve your own moral integrity. And this does not mean arrogance or cold indifference to the people around you. It means developing an inner compass so strong that outside opinions, even when you hear them clearly, no longer knock you off your course. There is a deep insight in this tradition, that the opinions others hold are so often projections of their own fears, rather than reflections of any real truth. When you understand that at a gut level, the desperate need for outside approval begins to dissolve. But this pillar requires deliberate practice. It begins with small decisions, where you choose to act on your own judgment, even knowing that others will disapprove. Wearing the clothes you love, even if someone thinks they're not appropriate for your age. Pursuing a hobby that others consider a waste of time. Expressing an opinion that goes against the consensus of the group. Each small act of autonomy strengthens the pillar, and in old age, when others may no longer depend on you, when your social role naturally shrinks, this pillar becomes your salvation, because you will have discovered something that most people never do, that the deepest form of respect comes from quietly accepting yourself, not having to justify anything, not having to prove anything, simply living the way you believe is right. The consequence of failing to build this pillar is an old age marked by bitterness. Nobody values me anymore. By resentment. I did everything for others and now I'm abandoned. By a collapse of identity, because the reflection in other people's eyes, the mirror you always relied on, now shows only indifference or absence. But the one who builds it stands free. And that freedom opens the door to the fourth and final thing, the one that brings all the others together. The fourth thing that brings the deepest happiness after 60 is fidelity to yourself, which is the most profound form of freedom there is. This is the culminating pillar, the synthesis of the three that came before it. Confucius identified here the ultimate meaning of autonomy, to live in such a way that each day, each action, each choice becomes an authentic expression of who you truly are. Fidelity to yourself is not selfishness, it is integrity. It is the refusal to betray your own principles, even when it would be easier, more comfortable, or more socially acceptable to do the opposite. It is staying connected to the moral core of your being, even when the whole world seems to conspire for you to lose yourself. Confucius observed a consistent and painful pattern. People who betray themselves again and again, who ignore their own needs, who violate their own values, who live inauthentic lives written by others, accumulate a kind of existential debt, and that debt charges its interest in old age. They arrive at the end of their lives and realize with horror that they never really lived. They were just characters in a script somebody else wrote for them. But this pillar shows itself in gestures that seem small and yet carry enormous meaning. A person who dresses with care every morning, even knowing that no one is coming to visit, not out of vanity, but as an act of self-love, a daily affirmation, I matter. My experience has value, even without an audience. Others tend to their plants, not for the harvest, but for the care itself. They do their gentle morning exercises so the body doesn't stiffen. They write their thoughts in a notebook so the day doesn't slip by unnoticed. Each of these actions is a quiet declaration. My life has meaning because I give it meaning, not because others recognize it. As Confucius understood it, the point of existence is not found in living alongside others, but in living with yourself in such a way that you can look in the mirror and genuinely respect the person you see. Relationships enrich that existence, but they cannot be its foundation. That foundation must come from within. This pillar demands a very specific kind of courage. The courage to believe that your life matters, even when no outside evidence confirms it. When you are no longer economically productive, when you are no longer socially relevant, when your body begins to fail, and even then, to find inner reasons to keep showing up, fully, for life. Neglecting this pillar leads to the most common tragedy of old age. Not death from physical illness, but a premature existential death. The person stops caring for themselves because they have internalized the indifference they feel coming from the world. They stop dressing well, eating properly, doing the things that once gave them joy. They give up on themselves long before their body ever gives up on them. But when this pillar is strong, something extraordinary happens. The person discovers that authentic freedom does not depend on outer circumstances at all. They act according to their inner principles, because that is simply who they are, not because they expect any reward or recognition. This is moral autonomy in its purest form. And here is the paradox at the very center of it all. Those who find the courage to build these four things discover that old age, so often feared as a season of loss, can become the freest chapter they will ever know. Because for the first time, perhaps, they are living by their own principles, and not by anyone else's commands. And once you understand all four, a single powerful image ties them all together. Confucius left us with a powerful picture. Imagine your life as a house built on mixed foundations. Part of it rests on solid rock, and part of it rests on sand. In youth and middle age, you can't tell the difference because everything seems stable. The walls stand, the roof protects you, everything works. But old age is like an inevitable storm that tests every inch of those foundations. The parts built on sand, your physical beauty, your economic productivity, your social roles, even some of your relationships, begin to sink. The storm shows no mercy. It reveals with perfect clarity exactly what was solid and what was only ever an illusion. If you built your entire identity on the sand, the house collapses, and you, who always defined yourself by those outer structures, collapse right along with it. But if you spent your years building inner pillars on the rock, the ability to be alone, order within, freedom from the judgment of others, and fidelity to yourself, those structures don't just survive the storm. They become more visible, more valuable, more essential than ever. There is another image worth holding on to. Think of most people as trees with wide but very shallow roots. In the spring and summer of life, when there's plenty of water near the surface, those roots work beautifully. The tree grows lush, bears fruit, looks perfectly healthy. But when the existential winter of old age arrives, when the surface waters, the easy relationships, the physical energy, the social relevance all dry up, those shallow roots can no longer reach any nourishment. The tree begins to wither, not from a lack of life within it, but from a lack of depth. The four pillars are like deep roots. You cultivate them by growing downward, toward the sources that never run dry, the inner springs of meaning, autonomy, and integrity. And when the surface waters inevitably disappear, those deep roots ensure that you go on, not merely surviving, but flourishing in ways that shallow-rooted trees will never know. Now, some people hear all of this and think, this sounds too philosophical, too abstract. How does it help with the real problems of old age? The loneliness, the illness, the physical limitations? And the answer that emerges from this wisdom is direct. These pillars do not eliminate the outer challenges of aging, but they completely transform your relationship with them. A person with well-developed inner autonomy experiences physical solitude in a radically different way than someone dependent on outside validation. The first finds in solitude a space for contemplation. The second finds only a terrifying void. The circumstance is identical. The inner experience could not be more different. Others will ask, but isn't focusing so much on yourself a form of selfishness? Shouldn't we focus on serving others? And here Confucius is subtle, but crucial. You cannot genuinely serve others while you are desperately dependent on them for your own sense of worth. That isn't generosity. It's a kind of neurotic transaction. I help you so that you will validate me. True freedom to serve only comes once you are already whole within yourself. And still others will say, but this seems to demand superhuman strength. What if I simply can't be that emotionally independent? Here the wisdom offers real comfort. These pillars are not built in an instant. They are cultivated over years through small but consistent practices. So let me give you 4 simple practices, one for each pillar, that you can begin today, no matter your age. For the first, cultivating the capacity to be alone. Set aside 30 minutes each day where you are completely by yourself, with no phone, no television, no distractions. At first, this will be uncomfortable. Observe that discomfort without judgment and gently ask yourself, why do I fear my own company? Use the time for things that build inner presence, reflective reading, writing in a journal, quiet contemplation. The goal is not productivity, but slowly learning to inhabit your own being without escape. Gradually, you will find that these moments stop being a torture and become a refuge. For the second, creating order. Choose one area of your life that has fallen into chaos, a closet, a drawer, an unfinished project. Devote yourself to organizing it completely, but do it as a spiritual practice, not just a household chore. As you go, ask of each object, does this still serve who I am now, or is it just the weight of the past? Practice deliberate letting go. For every 3 things you keep, force yourself to release one. Notice the emotional resistance that rises up, because that resistance is precisely the attachment that needs to be transcended. And then establish small, consistent daily rituals. A time to wake, a specific morning sequence, a moment of conscious eating. Not out of rigidity, but because outer structure creates the space for inner freedom. For the third, developing freedom from judgment. Practice small rebellions against social expectation. Wear the thing you love that others might find inappropriate. Express an opinion you know will be unpopular. Decline an invitation you genuinely don't want without inventing elaborate excuses. Keep a journal of these experiences. Notice how often you've changed your behavior anticipating disapproval, and how often the real disapproval turned out to be far milder than the one you imagined. The practice isn't about cultivating arrogance. It's about building an inner compass so strong that outside opinions, though heard, no longer pull you off course. And for the fourth, practicing fidelity to yourself. Identify 3 small actions you do each day purely for yourself, not to be productive, not to impress anyone, but simply because they dignify your own experience of being alive. A cup of coffee made with care. 5 minutes watching the natural world. A page read with full attention. What matters is the intention behind it. You are doing this because your life matters to you. So let me leave you with one final contrast, because I think it makes everything real. Imagine 2 people, both arriving at 75 years old. Both have lost a spouse. Both live with physical limitations. Both live relatively alone. The first person falls apart because they built their entire identity on outer structures that have now dissolved. They see themselves as a victim of time, abandoned by life, simply waiting for the end. The second person, who spent decades cultivating these 4 things, experiences the very same outer situation in a radically different way. The physical solitude becomes a space for deep contemplation. The physical limitations don't diminish their sense of worth, because that worth never depended on bodily performance in the first place. This second person reads not to impress anyone, but because ideas matter to them. They keep an orderly home, not in expectation of visitors, but as an expression of self-respect. They prepare their meals with care, not for a photo to share, but because the simple act of nourishing themselves with dignity is an affirmation. My life has meaning because I give it meaning. And this confronts us with an essential truth. The meaning of existence does not lie in living with others, but in living with yourself in such a way that you can look in the mirror and deeply respect the one you see. Relationships enrich that existence. They cannot be its foundation. That foundation must come from within. The second half of life, and old age especially, is not about repeating the patterns of the first half. It is about integration, about deepening, about discovering an autonomy that was impossible when your identity was still tied to social roles and outside validation. It is about becoming, at last, truly free. Not free from circumstances, but free from your dependence on them. And that is the most beautiful paradox of all. Those with the courage to build these four things discover that old age, so widely feared as a time of loss, can become the season of the greatest freedom they will ever experience. Because for the first time, they are living according to their own inner principles, and for the first time, they are genuinely, completely free. Now, I want to be honest and gentle with you as we close, because these are deep waters. This is a reflection on philosophy and on living well, offered to give you something to think about and to grow toward, not a set of rigid rules or a promise that any of this is easy. Building inner autonomy does not mean you should push away the people who love you or face real hardship entirely on your own. If you are struggling with genuine loneliness, grief, or sadness that feels heavy to carry, please don't carry it in silence. Reaching out to people you trust or to a caring professional is itself an act of wisdom and self-respect, not a failure of it. These pillars are meant to strengthen you from within, so that your connections with others become a free choice rather than a desperate need, never to replace the warmth of human connection altogether. Because in the end, this was never really about a philosopher who lived 25 centuries ago. It was about you and the quiet, extraordinary possibility that the years ahead of you can hold more freedom, not less. That the mirror you may fear can one day show you someone whole, someone at peace, someone who no longer needs the world's permission to feel that their life has meaning. That possibility is real, and it begins with a single small choice made today, and then another tomorrow. So here is my sincere invitation. Choose just one of these four things, the one that touched you most deeply as you listened, the one that made something in your chest go quiet, and begin cultivating it this week. Just one. Sit with yourself for a few minutes in silence. Clear one small corner of your home. Make one choice that is truly your own. You don't have to transform your whole life this weekend. You only have to take the first step, on purpose, and then the next. And if this reflection touched something in you, do me a kindness and leave your like, because that's how this wisdom reaches more people who need to hear it right now. Subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking this road together. And tell me down in the comments what city and state you're watching from, how old you are, and which of these four things you feel you most need to strengthen in your own life. Share this video with someone you love, especially someone navigating the challenges of these years, or someone in midlife who needs to start building these pillars now, before it's too late. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.